She was 20 years old, standing in the mud outside her uncle's gate, with everything she owned tied into a single flour sack bundle, when the door shut behind her for the last time. Clara Whitfield had been cast out by Silas Whitfield, the only kin she had left in the world, because she would not marry a widower twice her age to settle a debt that was never hers to pay. In her pocket she carried $14, every cent of it earned stitching gloves by candlelight long after her aunt and cousins had gone to bed, and with it, 3 days later, she bought the ruined Coldwater Tannery on the edge of Marrow Creek, Kansas, for $12, a building so far gone that the auctioneer laughed when she raised her hand to bid. Folks in town called it a foolish purchase, a joke played by fate on a girl who had already lost everything else. But high in the blackened rafters of that condemned old tannery lay something no living soul in Marrow Creek knew still existed, something that would not only save Clara Whitfield from ruin, but would settle a debt the whole town had been quietly carrying for a decade, without ever admitting it owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. If you have ever been told that what you carry is worthless, tell us where you are watching from tonight. To understand what Clara found in that tannery, you must first understand what her father gave her, because the two were never really separate things. Thomas Whitfield had come to Marrow Creek as a boy of 14, apprenticed to a stern, exacting master tanner named Josiah Pruitt, a man who ran the finest tannery between Wichita and the Territory line. Pruitt was not an easy teacher. He believed that leather, like character, revealed itself only under pressure, and he had little patience for a boy who flinched at the smell of the lime pits or the ache of scraping a hide clean through an entire winter night. But Thomas did not flinch, not once, and by the time he was a grown man with a young wife and a baby daughter, Josiah Pruitt had come to trust him more than he trusted his own kin, of which he had none left living. It was in the tannery's low-beamed workroom, thick with the smell of oak bark and tallow, that Clara spent the happiest hours of her early childhood, perched on an overturned barrel while her father worked, watching his hands move with a patience that seemed, to her small eyes, almost like prayer. He taught her the trade the way his own master had taught him, insisting she learn to read a hide the way other girls learn to read a hymnal, by touch, by smell, by the particular give of the skin under her fingers. "Any fool can see what's ruined," he told her once, working a stiff, sun-cracked hide that another tanner had thrown out as worthless. It takes patience to see what's still good underneath. She did not understand, at 7 years old, that he was teaching her more than a trade. She understood it later, when it was the only thing she had left of him. Her mother, Ruth, died delivering a stillborn son when Clara was 9, and something in Thomas Whitfield seemed to dim after that, though he never let it show in his hands, which remained as steady and sure at the tanning trestles as ever. He raised Clara alone in a small house 2 streets from the tannery, teaching her not only leather work but the quieter lessons that mattered more, that a debt paid was worth more than a debt forgiven, that a person's worth had nothing to do with what others said of them, that the plainest, most overlooked things in life were very often the ones holding the most value, if a body only troubled itself to look closely. He was not a wealthy man. Journeyman tanners rarely were, even skilled ones, and after old Josiah Pruitt's tannery burned in its outbuildings during a dry summer storm in 1874 and never fully recovered its trade, work grew scarcer still. But Thomas Whitfield never once spoke of himself as poor. He spoke of himself as fortunate because he had his hands, his trade, and his daughter, and he considered that a fuller inheritance than most men left behind. Clara held on to those words even after fever took him in the winter she turned 16, a swift and merciless illness that emptied half the beds in Marrow Creek's small church that season. In the last days, when he was too weak to lift his own head from the pillow, he had gripped her hand and murmured something she did not fully understand at the time, words she would turn over in her mind for years afterward, like a stone worn smooth by handling. "The rafters remember what the town forgot, Clara. Don't ever let them tear that old place down." She had thought it fever talk. She had been wrong. With her father gone and no mother to speak of, Clara was taken in by her uncle Silas, Thomas's older brother, a dry goods merchant with a comfortable storefront on Marrow Creek's main street, and a wife, Ida, who made it known within the first week that an extra mouth was a burden she had not asked to bear. Clara was given a cot in the storeroom above the shop and put to work from dawn until dark, sweeping, stocking, mending, and above all, sewing gloves and mending harness leather for the shop's small trade in such goods, since it was quickly discovered that she had inherited her father's sure hands with a needle and a hide. She did not complain. She had been raised to work quietly and well, and she told herself that 4 years of her uncle's grudging shelter was a small price for keeping a roof over her head until she was old enough to make her own way. She kept her father's few tools, a curved skiving knife, a bone folder, a small tin of dubbin, wrapped in oilcloth beneath her cot, and on the rare evenings she had to herself, she would take them out and run her thumb along the knife's worn handle, remembering the low hum of her father's voice as he worked, and the particular kind of quiet dignity he had carried even in his poorest years. It was, she would later say, the only inheritance that mattered, and the only one nobody could sell out from under her. She did not yet know how wrong she was about the second part. The trouble began, as trouble in small towns so often does, with a debt that had nothing to do with Clara at all. Her uncle Silas had, over the years, extended more credit than was wise to a widowed farmer named Otis Grundy, a man twice Clara's age with 3 young children and a debt at the dry goods store that had grown, through bad harvests and worse luck, to nearly $90, a sum Silas had quietly begun to despair of ever collecting. It was Ida, sharp-eyed and practical, who first proposed the arrangement over supper one evening, as though it were the most reasonable thing in the world. Otis needed a wife to raise his children and keep his house. Clara needed a household of her own instead of eating theirs bare, and the debt, conveniently, could simply be forgiven as a kind of dowry paid in reverse. Silas took to the idea readily, framing it to Clara not as a business transaction, but as an act of family duty, the sort of thing a grateful niece ought to be glad to offer after 4 years of charity. Clara refused. She refused gently at first, and then, when her uncle pressed harder, she refused with the same quiet steadiness her father had shown at the tanning trestles, reminding Silas that she had done 4 years of unpaid work in his shop that had more than settled any debt of gratitude she owed him, and that she would not be traded like a bolt of cloth to erase a stranger's account. Silas did not take the refusal well. He told her, in front of Ida and the shop boy, that she was an ungrateful, prideful girl who had inherited her father's foolish notions about worth, without her father's talent to back them up, and that a girl with no family, no dowry, and no prospects had no business turning up her nose at a respectable offer. Within the week, word had spread through Marrow Creek that Clara Whitfield had refused a good man out of pure vanity, and doors that might once have offered her honest work, as a seamstress, a hired girl, a shopkeeper's assistant, began quietly closing, because no one wished to cross Silas Whitfield's account book over a niece he no longer wanted. It was only after she had gone, bundle in hand, to the small boarding house run by a kind but struggling widow named Mrs. Odell that Clara learned the second, crueler part of what her uncle had done. Mrs. Odell, who had known Thomas Whitfield since he first came to town as a boy, let it slip one evening over a shared pot of tea that Silas had, in the 2 years after Thomas's death, quietly sold off the small parcel of land Thomas had owned outside town, along with a modest sum his brother had left in trust for Clara's eventual dowry, claiming the money had gone toward her keep. Mrs. Odell did not know the exact figures, but she knew enough to say that it had been more than 4 years of storeroom lodging could possibly account for. Clara felt something harden in her chest at the news. Not quite anger, something quieter and more resolute. The understanding that she had nothing left to lose by trusting no one's charity again, and everything to gain by trusting her own 2 hands instead. She had $14 saved from 4 years of glove money the shop had never quite managed to fully withhold from her, sewn into the hem of her one good coat. She had her father's tools, and she had, circling in her mind like a hawk over a field, her father's dying words about a place the town had long since written off. The Coldwater Tannery had stood empty for nearly 10 years by the time it came up at the county's tax auction that October, ever since old Josiah Pruitt had died alone and childless in the small caretaker's room behind the workshop. felled by what the doctor called a seizure of the heart. No relative had ever come forward to claim the property, and the county, after years of unpaid taxes accumulating against an estate with no living heir to collect from, had finally moved to sell it outright to recover what it could. It was not a building anyone wanted. The roof sagged where a beam had rotted through. The old lime pits had filled with brackish rainwater and gone green with algae, and a persistent rumor held that the place was unlucky, cursed even, on account of the outbuilding fire years before that had also, through some tangled chain of town gossip, come to be blamed on Pruett himself, though no one could say precisely why or how. When the auctioneer called the property, standing on an overturned crate in the cold October wind, with perhaps a dozen townsfolk gathered more out of curiosity than interest, no one raised a hand for a full, awkward minute. Clara raised hers before she had entirely decided to. Perhaps it was her father's words returning to her, unbidden, the way grief sometimes surfaces in the body before the mind has caught up to it. Perhaps it was simply that $12 was the only sum in the world that stood between her and true homelessness, and here was a roof, however broken, that no one else wanted badly enough to bid against her. The auctioneer laughed, not unkindly, and asked if she was quite certain, and someone in the small crowd murmured that the Whitfield girl had lost her wits along with her uncle's good favor. Clara paid her $12 in coin, folded the deed into her coat beside her last two remaining dollars, and walked the half-mile to the tannery alone, in the fading afternoon light, to see what she had bought. What she found, standing in the doorway with the last of the daylight slanting through gaps in the roof, was worse than she had braced herself for, and, somehow, exactly what she had expected all the same. The great workroom where her father had once labored was thick with dust and old cobweb, the tanning trestles collapsed on one side, the lime pits stagnant and foul-smelling, and yet beneath the ruin she could see, with a tanner's trained eye, the good bones of the place. Solid oak framing, a chimney that had drawn true, stone footings that had not shifted an inch in 10 years of neglect. She spent that first night wrapped in her coat on a dry patch of floor near the hearth, too tired and too resolved to be frightened of the dark, or the scurrying sounds in the walls. And in the days that followed she began, with a single borrowed broom and her father's small tools, the slow work of making the place livable. She patched the worst of the roof with scavenged shingle and pitch. She scrubbed the lime pits clean and let them dry in the autumn sun. And on the fourth evening, climbing into the loft above the workroom to assess the damage to the rotted beam her father's words had lodged so strangely in her memory, she noticed, by lantern light, a section of the rafter near the chimney that did not sit quite true against its neighbors. A hand's width of darker, newer wood set into the old, as though someone had once cut a section free and fitted it carefully back into place. Her father's hands had taught her to notice such things. She worked the loose board free with the flat of her skiving knife, and behind it, tucked into a hollow carved neatly into the beam itself, she found a small wooden box wrapped tight in oiled canvas, dry and undisturbed, exactly as it had been left. She did not open it that first night. She sat with it in her lap for a long while instead, turning it over in the lantern light, some instinct telling her that whatever lay inside deserved to be met with a clear head and not the trembling hands of exhaustion. When she finally worked the small brass clasp free the following evening, what she found was not gold, not yet, but something that would prove, in its way, more valuable still. A leather-bound ledger, its pages filled edge to edge in a small, precise hand she recognized, with a jolt, as belonging to Josiah Pruett himself, having seen his signature countless times on receipts her father brought home. Tucked into the ledger's back pages were several letters, folded and sealed with wax that had never been broken, addressed simply to Thomas Whitfield, or whoever he trusts to find this in his place. Clara sat with the unopened letters for a long time before she allowed herself to break the seal, aware in some deep, unspoken way that she was about to learn something her father had died without ever quite telling her. The ledger, read slowly over the following week by lamplight, after her days of hauling water and scraping mold from the walls, told a story far larger and stranger than Clara had imagined. In the years before the Great Fire that had ruined his outbuildings, Josiah Pruitt had secured a substantial contract to supply tanned harness leather and saddle goods to the Army garrison at a frontier post 2 counties distant, a contract that promised to make the Coldwater Tannery the most prosperous business in the region. But the contract's payment had become entangled in a dispute between the post's quartermaster and the contracting office back east, a dispute that dragged on for nearly 3 years while Pruitt continued to supply goods on credit he could ill afford, sinking deeper into debt to keep his promise and his reputation intact. It was during those same difficult years that the fire broke out in his curing sheds, and though the true cause was never proven, a lantern left burning too near the drying racks, most likely, by an exhausted worker, rumor in town had quickly settled on Pruitt himself, whispering that a man so deep in debt might have set the blaze himself for the insurance money, or worse, that the fire had spread, through carelessness or malice, to the edge of the schoolyard, scorching the old schoolhouse's foundation timbers so badly that the building had to be condemned and the children of Marrow Creek left to study in a drafty church basement for want of a proper school. No formal accusation was ever brought against him, but he did not need one. The town's suspicion was punishment enough, and Josiah Pruitt, once a respected craftsman, spent his final years shunned at church, passed over at town meetings, and quietly erased from the community he had spent 30 years serving. The bitterest irony, the ledger revealed, was that the disputed Army contract was finally settled in Pruitt's favor nearly 2 years after the fire, paid out at last not in a bank draft as he had expected, but in gold double eagles, the quartermaster's office having little faith left in the region's shaky banking houses after the panic that had swept the country in 1873. By the time the gold arrived, delivered quietly by a government courier, to a man the whole town had already condemned in its heart, Pruitt had lost whatever trust he once held in Marrow Creek entirely. He wrote in a passage Clara read 3 times over by lamplight that he could not bring himself to hand a single coin to a town that had let him burn twice, once in his sheds and once again in the court of its own gossip, and so he had hidden the gold, coin by coin, in the rafters above the very workroom where he had trained her father, telling himself he would decide, someday, what to do with it. But the letters, dated in the final months of his life, told a different story than the bitterness of the ledger's earlier pages. Age and illness had softened him, or perhaps simply given him time enough to grieve his own hardness of heart, and in his last letter, penned in a hand grown shaky and uneven, he wrote that he intended, before he died, to give the whole sum to the town, earmarked specifically for the rebuilding of the schoolhouse his fire had ruined, as an act of quiet forgiveness the town had never asked for, but that he wished to offer all the same. He had meant to tell Thomas Whitfield, the one man in Marrow Creek who had never once looked at him with suspicion, and to ask him to see the gift carried out properly, honestly, without fanfare. But the seizure of the heart that took him came before he could finish the errand, and the tannery, with no will on file and no heir to claim it, had simply been left to the county, its secret sealed into the rafters along with the last honest wish of a broken man. Clara sat alone in the lantern light with the final letter in her hands, understanding at last what her father had meant with his dying words, and understanding too that the debt Josiah Pruitt had died owing was not to any bank or contractor, but to a town that had wronged him and never known it. For a time, Clara told no one what she had found, working instead to shore up the tannery's roof and walls with the last of her coin, while she decided, carefully and alone, what honoring Pruitt's wish would actually require of her. But secrets in a small town have a way of loosening at the seams, and it was a hired carpenter, a good-natured but talkative man named Ferris Boone, who Clara had engaged to help repair the worst of the roof beams, who first noticed the dull gleam of a coin she had tucked, without thinking, into her apron pocket, while counting the fortune the ledger had promised was hidden throughout the rafters in small oilcloth pouches, nearly $1,200 in gold in total, an almost unimaginable sum for Marrow Creek. Ferris Boone was not a malicious man, but he was a man with a fondness for the saloon and a weakness for a good story, and within 2 days, the whole of Marrow Creek was buzzing with talk that the Whitfield girl had found Josiah Pruitt's fabled lost fortune hidden in the old Tannery's bones. The story reached Ambrose Kettering, the town's banker and its most ambitious land speculator, within the hour. And Kettering, who had quietly tried to buy the condemned Tannery property from the county himself 2 years prior, intending to raise it and use the land for a proposed rail spur he hoped to bring investors in on, saw in the rumor both an insult and an opportunity. He moved quickly, filing a claim with the county court arguing that the tax sale to Clara had been improperly conducted on a technicality of notice, and that regardless, any property or valuables found upon the land rightfully belonged to Pruitt's unsettled estate, which, absent an heir, ought to pass to the county, a county whose land office, everyone in town understood without needing to say it aloud, worked rather closely with Ambrose Kettering's bank. It was in the midst of this legal maneuvering that Silas Whitfield reappeared at Clara's door for the first time since he had put her out, his manner suddenly warm in a way she had not seen from him since her father's funeral, speaking of family duty and the natural claim an uncle held over a niece not yet come of full legal age, and hinting, none too subtly, that he intended to petition the court himself for guardianship over her affairs, gold included, framing it as concern for her welfare rather than the plain and obvious truth of it. Clara felt something cold settle over her at his sudden solicitude, but she did not raise her voice or accuse him outright. She simply asked, in the same steady tone her father had used at the tanning trestles, what had become of the parcel of land and the trust money he had told her, 4 years ago, had gone entirely toward her keep, and watched the warmth drain quickly from her uncle's face when he realized she had learned more in her exile than he had ever intended her to know. He left without an answer, but Clara understood the shape of the fight now bearing down on her from 2 directions at once: a banker who wanted her land and an uncle who wanted her fortune. And she understood, too, that the only weapon she possessed against either of them was the plain, unglamorous truth sitting in the ledger and letters she had guarded so carefully. The matter came before the county court on a bright, cold morning in November, in a crowded meeting hall that had drawn nearly every resident of Marrow Creek curious enough to see how the Whitfield girl's fortune would be settled. Ambrose Kettering had engaged a lawyer from the county seat to argue that the tax sale was void, and the gold, as unclaimed estate property, belonged to the county's coffers, a position he framed with great civic solemnity as being in the town's own best interest, though more than a few in the room noted, in low murmurs, that Kettering's interest in the Tannery's land had begun rather suspiciously 2 years before any rumor of gold had surfaced. Silas Whitfield, for his part, sat near the front with Ida beside him, prepared to press his own claim of guardianship the moment Kettering's argument failed, but he had reckoned without Mrs. Odell, who rose unbidden from the gallery to inform the court, in her plain, unhurried way, precisely how much of Thomas Whitfield's land and trust money had vanished under his brother's management in the years since his death, a detail that drew a hard, uncomfortable silence from the room and left Silas's face the color of old ash. When it came Clara's turn to speak, she did not raise her voice or plead for sympathy. She simply opened Josiah Pruitt's ledger before the assembled court and read, in full, his final letter, his account of the fire, the suspicion that had broken him, and his last wish, penned in a failing hand, to give every coin of that hard-won gold to the rebuilding of the schoolhouse his Tannery's fire had ruined, as a quiet act of forgiveness toward a town he had loved, even after it turned against him. She watched the room grow still as she read, watched old men who had once whispered against Pruitt at church lower their eyes to the floor, watched the schoolteacher, Miss Adeline Pratt, who had taught 2 generations of Marrow Creek's children in a drafty borrowed church basement, press a hand to her mouth. Clara told the court plainly that she claimed no right to the gold beyond the right to see Josiah Pruitt's dying wish carried out honestly, exactly as he had written it, and that she intended, with the court's blessing, to use every dollar to rebuild the schoolhouse in his name, and to use whatever remained after that to reopen the Coldwater Tannery itself, not for her own enrichment alone, but as a trade that could employ the town's widows, its idle young men, its own overlooked and written off, The way her father had once believed any hide, however ruined it looked at first glance, still held good leather underneath, if a person had the patience to find it. The county judge, who had known Pruitt slightly in his own younger years and remembered with visible discomfort how quickly the town had turned against him, ruled within the hour that the tax sale stood as lawful, that the gold belonged rightfully to Clara Whitfield as owner of the property in which it was found, and that her stated intention to honor the letter's wish was, in his words, more justice than the county's own records could claim credit for in a decade. Ambrose Kettering's claim was dismissed outright, and it did not escape the room's notice, in the weeks that followed, how quickly his standing among the town's merchants cooled once his maneuvering over the Tannery's land became common knowledge, nor how many of his depositors quietly moved their savings elsewhere, judging a man by the same plain measure he had tried, and failed, to apply to Clara. Silas Whitfield's guardianship petition was never even formally entered. He withdrew it before the judge could rule, and though no formal charge was ever brought against him for the missing trust money, the town's memory proved a harder court than any bench, and his dry goods trade, once the busiest on Main Street, thinned steadily as neighbors who had once extended him easy credit began, quietly and without explanation, to take their business elsewhere. It is worth pausing here, before we close this story, to remember the girl who stood in the mud outside her uncle's gate with a flour sack bundle and $14, and to notice how little, in truth, had changed about her between that cold afternoon and the bright November morning she stood before the county court. She had not grown wealthy in her own name, not truly, having given the whole of Pruitt's fortune to a school and a trade meant to serve others rather than herself. She had not gained back a family, having watched her uncle's warmth reveal itself as calculation the moment real money entered the room. What she had done instead was exactly what her father had spent a childhood teaching her to do without either of them ever naming it plainly. She had looked at something the world had already written off: a ruined tannery, a dead man's tarnished reputation, a debt long since abandoned as unpayable, and she had taken the patience to see what was still good underneath. The new schoolhouse that rose on Marrow Creek's outskirts the following spring bore a small brass plaque near its door, reading simply, "In memory of Josiah Pruitt, Master Tanner," and the reopened Coldwater Tannery, staffed within its first year by 6 townsfolk who had struggled to find honest work elsewhere, bore no plaque at all, because Clara Whitfield had never much cared for having her name carved into anything. She cared only that the Rafters, at last, no longer had to remember what the town had forgotten, because the town remembered it plainly now, on its own. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Clara Whitfield tonight. If her story moved you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need the reminder that value has a way of hiding in the last places anyone thinks to look. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found real worth in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and we're always glad for the company. Until next time, stay close.